In the blistering heat of 1200 BC, a young girl named Nefertari knelt on the scorching stones of the Karnak temple courtyard, while bronze razors methodically erased her identity. This wasn't a choice or a casual haircut. It was a calculated ritual of purification that stripped every single strand of hair from her body to prepare her for a life of absolute religious bondage. Behind the towering, gold-flecked pillars and the sweet, heavy scent of frankincense, the Egyptian priesthood operated a shadow empire that traded in human flesh and systematic silence. We often look at these majestic ruins as symbols of divine wisdom, but the reality was a brutal machine of social control where the line between holiness and horror was non-existent. To understand the terrifying reality of these temple virgins, you have to look past the hieroglyphs and see the temples for what they actually were, the ultimate corporate banks of the ancient world. They didn't just collect prayers. They owned more land than the nobility, controlled more grain than the pharaoh, and operated as the primary lenders to a desperate, starving population. When a family fell into a cycle of crushing debt, the priests didn't just seize their fields. They offered a holy way out by demanding the family's daughter as permanent repayment. This was a world where faith was the ultimate currency, and the high priests were the only ones holding the keys to the vault. 1. The high priests of the Temple of Amun, around 1200 BC, held more practical economic power than the pharaoh himself. They controlled vast grain reserves and functioned as the primary debt collectors for the entire Nile Delta region. And if a farmer couldn't pay his taxes, the temple would legally seize his children as divine interest. 2. Entry into the priesthood required a total physical transformation, shaving every single hair on the body twice a day. This wasn't just for hygiene in the Egyptian heat. It was a psychological tactic to strip away individuality and ensure no lice could ever defile the sacred space. Any priest caught with a single stray hair during a ritual faced immediate and violent expulsion. 3. Young girls like Nefertari were often donated to the temple by parents who believed this sacrifice would end local droughts or plagues. The priests encouraged this superstition, promising the child would live a life of divine light, while knowing she would spend decades grinding grain in windowless basements. These girls became the wives of the god, a title that sounded prestigious but functioned as a mask for unpaid labor. 4. The initiation ritual involved a mandatory cold water immersion in sacred pools that was less about spiritual cleansing and more about physical dominance. Older priestesses like the historical figure Tayat were forced to supervise these washings, ensuring the girls were inspected for any physical imperfections. If a girl flinched or cried during the ice-cold ritual, she was marked as unclean and subjected to immediate corporal punishment. 5. Temple records from ancient Thebes show that girls were stripped of their birth names and assigned administrative numbers instead. A specific papyrus lists over 3,000 yards of linen woven by these invisible women in a single month, treating them as industrial assets rather than human beings. This systematic erasure of their past lives ensured they had no identity to return to if they ever escaped. 6. The sacred union was the most guarded secret of the Egyptian priesthood, occurring during the holiest nights of the lunar calendar. Priests claimed the god Amun would manifest through a human vessel to ensure the Nile's annual flooding and the kingdom's survival. In reality, this was a ritualized form of assault where the high priest, wearing a golden mask, claimed total divine ownership over the temple virgins. 7. Privacy was an impossible luxury. The Book of Purity mandated that temple women could never speak unless directly commanded by a superior. They were forbidden from making eye contact with priests and had to eat their meager rations of barley in absolute, crushing silence. This sensory deprivation was a deliberate tool used to break the spirit and ensure unquestioning obedience to temple authority. 8. Resistance was rare, but it took the form of hidden codes woven into the very linen the women produced for the altars. Archaeologists have found ancient fabrics where intentional mistakes in the stitching actually formed secret symbols of defiance, like a crossed eye meaning, "I see the lie." These tiny acts of rebellion were the only way for the women to communicate their shared trauma without alerting the overseers. 9. Pregnancy among temple virgins was a scandalous reality that the priesthood managed by moving the women to secret high-security wings. These women were rebranded as holy vessels, carrying the seeds of the gods, yet forbidden from ever raising the children they birthed. When a child was born, it was immediately seized by the temple and funneled back into the same system of servitude. 10. The Temple of Mut in Nubia specialized in taking children as tribute from conquered territories to serve as perpetual laborers. A 10-year-old girl named Iseri was reportedly traded by her mother during a catastrophic famine in exchange for a few sacks of temple grain. She was marched across the desert in chains, only to be told upon arrival that she was chosen and blessed by the gods. 11. Punishment for even minor infractions, like whispering to another girl during a ritual, involved kneeling for hours in open courtyards under 110-degree sun. The priests believed the sun god would burn away the impurity of the girl's defiance, often leading to severe dehydration and permanent scarring. High-ranking priestesses were forced to recite hymns of purity over the suffering girls to reinforce the idea that their pain was divine. 12. The priesthood operated a sophisticated misinformation campaign, telling families that their daughters were living in luxury and eating the finest meats. In reality, the girls survived on leftover scraps of offerings that were often rotting or infested with vermin. This lie ensured the local population remained complicit in the system, even as their children were being methodically destroyed behind the walls. 13. One woman named Renutma famously broke the silence during a temple meal by shouting that the priests were not gods but men who fear the truth. She was immediately dragged to the temple gates and sentenced to dedication to the desert, a death sentence where the victim was left without water. This brutal execution was designed to show the other women that the desert would purify anyone who dared to speak. 14. To prevent friendships and potential uprisings, the priests frequently rotated the women between different temples across Egypt. If two girls showed signs of emotional bonding, they were separated by hundreds of miles of desert and forbidden from ever sending messages. This forced isolation turned the temple into a psychological prison, where the only allowable relationship was with the silent stone statues. 15. Priests used dream interpretation as a tool for psychological warfare, telling the women that their private thoughts were being monitored by the gods. If a girl admitted to feeling sad or angry, the priest would claim the gods had revealed her darkness in a vision. This created a culture of extreme self-censorship, where the women were afraid to even think about rebellion, for fear of divine retribution. 16. The shaving of the head was more than a ritual. It was a recurring trauma that happened every few days to maintain a perfectly smooth scalp. The bronze razors were often dull and caused chronic skin infections and permanent baldness in many of the younger girls. This constant physical maintenance served as a reminder that their bodies were no longer their own, but temple property to be scoured. 17. Archaeologists at Karnak discovered a secret stash of papyrus hidden beneath the foundation stones of a priestess's quarters. These testimonies of the silent contained first-hand accounts of the suffering the women endured, written by a priestess who risked execution to preserve the truth. Her writings revealed that the sacred hymns were actually viewed as a mockery by the very women forced to sing them. 18. The golden wigs worn by temple virgins during public ceremonies weighed several pounds and were designed to be intentionally uncomfortable. Decorated with heavy jewelry that pulled at the scalp, they made it impossible for the wearer to look anywhere but down. This forced posture of humility was a physical manifestation of the mental weight the priesthood placed on their subjects. 19. In the temple of Hathor, the goddess of joy, women were forced to dance until they collapsed from exhaustion during festivals. The priests marketed these dances as ecstatic worship, but the participants were often drugged with blue lotus wine to keep them moving through the pain. Any dancer who stopped before the ritual was completed was viewed as a blight on the community and severely disciplined. 20. The high priests maintained a ledger of souls that tracked the utility of every woman in the temple, from weaving capacity to ritual performance. If a woman became too old or sick to work, she wasn't given medical care but was reassigned to the most dangerous and degrading tasks. This cold, industrial approach to human life predates modern factory exploitation by over 3,000 years. 21. Even death was controlled by the priesthood. Temple virgins were often denied traditional Egyptian burial rites if they died in a state of doubt. Their bodies were sometimes cast into the Nile without the necessary amulets for the afterlife, the ultimate psychological threat in ancient Egyptian culture. This ensured that the fear of the priesthood extended even beyond the grave and into eternity. 22. And finally, a Nubian girl named Muda left a last inscription on a pottery shard found in a dark storage chamber before she died. She scratched the words, "I never forgot who I was before they took me," proving that decades of temple brainwashing couldn't erase her original identity. Her silent defiance remains one of the few surviving voices of a system that tried to turn human beings into nothing more than shadows.